Another crucial issue facing President-elect Biden is the behavior of the US's security partners in the Persian Gulf, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We've seen under President Trump a very close relationship with the House of Saud, which contravenes efforts by Congress to question massive arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, specifically concerning the humanitarian abuses, human rights violations, outright aggression, and possible war crimes that will implicate the United States against Yemen. That moving forward, what President-elect Biden would need to do immediately is end all support for the Saudi-led war bombardment of Yemen. The UAE has largely pulled out of Yemen at this point, although they do maintain a presence in certain parts of the country, such as the island of Socotra and the region of Al-Mahra. So, and the Trump administration has just announced through Secretary Pompeo that they have approved a $23 billion arms sale to the UAE, which includes the controversial sale of F-35 aircraft. This needs to be stopped. If there's any way that it's unclear sort of what the timeline is on that, it may have already gotten started by the time President Biden takes office, but if he's able to put a halt to that, the UAE is equally culpable in the misery of the people of Yemen. And the entire premise that the Trump administration has used to justify, ramming through arms sales using a false declaration emergency, for example, to override a congressional vote against arms sales to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. This has all been justified by this supposed threat of Iran, which is completely false. That not that Iran is not a threat, but the way that the Trump administration has portrayed it does not reflect reality. Iran does not fundamentally threaten the United States. And what we've observed from the behavior of the UAE and Saudi Arabia is that they're not all that concerned about Iran either. The way that the UAE has behaved, it has engaged in, I think, constructive outreach to Iran, knowing that it's in the UAE's interest to not get a war started in its backyard. The behavior of the UAE has been much more oriented around the perceived threat of Turkey as a sponsor of Islamists, which UAE sees as potentially destabilizing for its own interests and for its own ruling power. Saudi Arabia also is concerned about the power of Islamists, seeing Qatar as a sponsor of Islamists, seeing Turkey as a potential threat. And so neither of them are behaving in ways that indicate that they actually see Iran as this existential threat, but they like to use that as a justification when they talk to the Trump administration, which is populated by individuals that are very inclined to see Iran as a threat. So moving forward, the Biden administration needs to end this unproductive sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We need to fundamentally rethink our relationship with these two security partners who are acting in ways that are very destabilizing in the region, such as in Yemen, for example, as well as in Syria, as well as in Libya, where these countries are involved in exacerbating further instability, leading to greater displacement of populations, which is we obviously are observing impacting our actual allies in Europe. Leading to the rise of far-right populist movements there as well in response to wave of displaced peoples. So moving forward, it's just not clear why the United States would continue to prioritize the preferences of Saudi Arabia and the UAE over actual US interests. And so a crucial thing to resolve that would be insisting that Saudi Arabia and the UAE fix the Gulf rift, that they end the blockade of Qatar. Again, putting lie to the idea that the notion that Qatar was actually the problem, again, if the whole narrative that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been trying to spin is that Iran is this primary source of threat, then why did they turn around and go after Qatar in 2017? They've said that Qatar was the state sponsor of terror, et cetera, but there's really been very little evidence for that beyond that wouldn't also implicate the ways in which the UAE and Saudi Arabia have also sponsored groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Syria, for example. So moving forward, the Biden administration must completely rethink its engagement with these unhelpful so-called security partners in the region. And moving forward, the Biden administration also needs to get troops out of the Middle East, specifically in Iraq and Syria. but also needs to rethink our military footprint in the region more generally, that it's unclear why we maintain such inordinate troop levels in places like Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain and the UAE, and we have troops in Saudi Arabia again. So again, that the current military footprint represents kind of a response to the original Gulf War in the early 90s against Saddam Hussein, that the United States military is set up to fight a threat like that. And that has not been the threat for 30 years. So the United States military really has to rethink its force posture in the region. And I would argue needs to really reduce the presence of US troops in the Middle East.